Hello, dear students. This is once again Professor Dr. Zia Ahmed on this very short lecture in order to have a view of world literature. When we talk of the word literature, at that time, one of the aspects of this literature comes forward, and this is the very aspect which makes it a word literature. This is translation. Because unless we have translations or we have done translations, we cannot understand the literatures written in different languages of the world. So that is why it is very much essential to know how translations play a big role in making this literature, rather the masterpieces of literature, into a word literature. We can also talk about here what makes it word literature. If it has been written by the word or for the word, no, it's not the case. These literatures were also written for their national territories or the people. But then, with the passage of time, what happened? That these literatures became very classical, very important, and because of that, they gained such an importance that these literatures were found to be read by a number of people. So, in order to gain the wider audience or to convey the message to the world, these were translated into different languages, and so these type of archaic, classical, and grand literatures were called to be the world literatures. Because of the translation aspect of this word literature, importance of translation has increased many fields. For example, what happens when we translate one piece of work into another language? A type of cultural exchange takes place because every literature is filled up, is immersed in, is created in the context of a particular culture that reflects the traditions and the culture of that time, the ideas and customs of that time. So when we read the translated literature, we become aware of the cultural things which happened at that time when the literature was created. And so, because of this tendency available in the word literatures based on translation, it creates and enhances the understanding all over the globe, all over the world. It promotes empathy by showcasing diverse viewpoints. This is definitely clear. If the viewpoints are only one and one keeps that viewpoint, does not let the other viewpoint come in at that time, the understanding reduces. So, the importance of translation in the world literatures is based on this factor that it increases the global understanding. And not only it increases the global understanding, it also helps us understand more with respect to the preservation, because once one piece of literature is translated from one language to the other, definitely it becomes the source and the way to preserve. So that is why translations become really very significant in this regard. But there could be the problems of translation as well. So let us see what these problems can be when one piece of literature is translated into another one. The very first thing is relevant to the linguistic nuances, because when we read one language and try to translate it into another one, we have the difficulty of 100% understanding the linguistic nuances of that language. So it is really difficult to translate or to transform one language into another, and so the shades of the meaning are not conveyed in that way as it should have been conveyed. This poses a big challenge. And then there are the cultural context. This cultural context means that when the literature, a particular piece of literature was created, for example, uh, Homer's Virgil or Aeneid by other classical poets, or even the dramas which were created by Sophocles, for example, these were created in a particular cultural context. But when the translator is translating, at that time the cultural context is no more available. So that is why it's really very, very problematic to translate the cultural context from one language to the other. So translation creates the problems, and similarly is the case with the voice of the author. When an author creates the work at that time, he has a different voice. He's got in his mind certain things and the style and the other essential things, or the problems which he faces. But as soon as the time passes, the space changes, the translations come in. At that time, it becomes really difficult to make a true understanding of the voice of the author. So, even if translations convey the kind of literature that we want to study, that becomes difficult. that becomes difficult for the translator to convey all those things which he should have actually conveyed. And now let's see what happens when a classical novel is reimagined in translation. And because of that translation, the classical novel becomes the most important kind of thing with which one must get acquaintance as much as possible. So let us see what happens at that time when the classical novels are translated for the sake of the word. For example, the very first thing is the fresh interpretation of any piece of literature. If, for example, we have Sophocles' play or we have any epic by the classical poet, when we try to translate it, what we are doing actually, we are refreshing, we are contemporizing, or we are trying to give a unique perspective to the translation. And same is the case with the accessibility, which definitely increases because of this translation. Number of people, number of audiences become important. And the culture related to that also becomes relevant. There are gaps definitely between the cultures of the two people, or the two nations, or two states or countries, and these gaps can be bridged by having a good understanding of the pieces of literature which were considered once to be very classical ones. There is another dominant aspect, and that is the aspect of colonialism and post colonialism. This has been the major event in the world history, and it has given birth to a number of issues, for example, especially with respect to the marginalized voices. The voice of the people, for example, when it is reflected by the indigenous person, indigenous writer at that time, he is maximum making his effort to voice the opinion of the marginalized communities. But on the other hand, if it's created, literature is created by the person who is a occupier or colonizer at that time, not only identity of the people, local people is destroyed, but also the voice of the marginal people do not reach them. But however, this translation, if we do, for example, if a literature is produced by some white man and that is translated into local indigenous language, it creates a type of understanding that at least we are able to understand what our identity has been portrayed, what kind of voice we can raise, and why we were not allowed to raise the voices. So, this very literature, on the basis of translation, when it becomes word literature, it raises the voices of the marginalized communities. It helps them reclaim their cultural identity and promotes understanding among the people. This thing is done most of the time in poetry also. The representation of the rhythm and the rhyme and the emotion, which is done most of the time by poetry, that is also highlighted through this kind of literature, which we call word literature, because this is the very work which creates more and more understanding of the techniques of writing, of the fiction writing, and of the diction which the poets use and the emotions. How do they convey? All this is understood only because of the word literature. Because we don't know how the poets did in Greek ages, we don't know how the poets did in Spanish country, but if we get the translation, we are able to understand these things as well. There are also the other benefits of all that. For example, we are able to understand the folk tales of the people, of different environs, of different styles of the people. We come to know what their folk tales are, and that's also possible only through this translation. And secondly, we also come to know about the myths of the people. That also helps us understand the cultural background of the people, some of the legends which the people have created with the passage of time. That can also be understood only because of the translations, which is done in order to make the literature a word literature. We can now see in this new dimension what would be the future of this word literature. First, it was required that somebody should translate, but now we have a kind of technology, and that technology helps us to translate one piece of literature into any language that we want to do, and AI powered tools are very helpful in this case. And as a result, more and more collaborative efforts are occurring that these pieces of literature may be translated in a very culturally expert way, and in that way it can bring us the real picture which the writer wanted at that time. And then the accessibility has also increased. So this can be claimed right now because of the artificial intelligence and technology like that in the 21st century can definitely help us a lot in having an understanding of the pieces of literature, because the translations can be done so quickly and so easily.